Let's not bury the lead.
There's a lot, and again, you look at, the Eastern churches. They were very subservient to the state.
They
There's
got
a lot of things.
completely bulldozed by communism.
Right, yeah, I mean, which admittedly, to be fair, and anybody would have been bulldozed by communism. You're in a totalitarian state, you're going to get bulldozed. But the point, I think, being too, I mean, really, do you want to live in one of these countries? Do you really want to live in an Orthodox country where the culture is shaped by Eastern Orthodoxy? Most of us don't want to live
Well, Byrne does, but
in Eastern Europe. I mean, like that's a reality.
and Rod Dreher lives in Hungary. And if you know a little bit of church history, Hungary was a pretty reformed country.
And the truth is, the reality is that we live in a modern society. Unless the Kaczynski apocalypse occurs, we're going to continue living in a modern society. And Protestantism is the only Christian branch of Christianity that actually understands modernism and modern society because it created modern society. And I think the sad thing is that modern contemporary evangelicals have basically rejected their own theological history and their own cultural history, and as a result, they actually don't have what people are looking for. Now, obviously, a lot of people still, become Christian in these churches, so they're good, and the Pentecostals are doing incredible, particularly with people, from kind of lower middle class type backgrounds. So it's all bad. But in terms of, I think, capturing elites for certain, it doesn't really have a compelling message, and I think a big part of it is because they've flat out sort of rejected their own heritage.
Yeah.
And I think you see that every time I read a book that talks about the history of Protestantism and the culture of Protestantism, whether that be Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, all the way up to James Davison Hunter's new book, Democracy and Solidarity, what they describe as the Protestant culture is completely alien to modern evangelical culture. It's certainly not culturally Protestant. In the sense people would have understood it, I think in the past, and even its theology is closer to the radical Reformation than traditional to the traditional Reformed Calvinistic influences on the United States. Of course, through the Quakers, we had a big influence, from kind of radical Christianity as well. But you just see it, and I've this debate over this book by a guy named Stephen Wolfe, The Case for Christian Nationalism, which he's a PhD in political science, and he makes I don't know how to assess it. I'm not qualified to assess it, but he definitely makes very logical arguments drawn from Reformation theologies about politics. And I think what's interesting is, basically the critics of his book, the debates over that book, and I've said I'm not a Christian national, I reject Christian nationalism, but the debates over his book showed me that most evangelicals explicitly reject what the reformers taught. I don't think there is an evangelical Reformed denomination today that would not excommunicate John Calvin. I mean, they would. I mean, it's like they would excommunicate the reformers if they showed up today with their beliefs. And so they're essentially Anabaptist belief systems. They're essentially quasi-Anabaptist theologies. Their lack of Protestant cultural heritage is, I think, is a huge weakness. And one of the reasons that, again, it was Calvinistic Christianity that built the great intellectual center of our nation in Boston. I mean, that's a complete product of Puritan culture. E. Digby Baltzell's phenomenal book, Puritan Boston and Quaker Philadelphia, goes into like, well, why Boston became like the intellectual, scientific, cultural, political center of the country is like, that's what created it. And when we've sort of, decided to abandon all that, which is sad because, for most of our history, Protestantism would have rightly been seen as the elite option, and Catholicism would have been seen as the kind of peasant option.
Yeah, immigrant option, the ethnic option. Right. It keeps you out of the country club option.
Sam's clearly got the God mode on his mic with all the reverb, but it didn't. I was expecting Sam to come in for it was the Unitarian vision that gave us this religious pluralism in America, and it came out of Poland and Hungary. And Sam, this was your moment. I mean, Aaron Renn was just doing work for the Calvinist Puritans, and you didn't want to tick off your guest. What was with the silence? Why'd you pull your punches, Sam?
Yeah, and so and maybe there's some class snobbery there that we shouldn't go into. But I mean, when you look at when you look at it, what has happened, and this happened in kind of the 50s. I mentioned we shift from this sort of Anglo-Protestant conception of America to a sort of Judeo-Christian conception of America, which integrated the Ellis Island people. Like my family, I'm actually from Catholic peasant stock on both sides of my family. I still have family in Sicily, and sort of integrated them into the American mainstream. And as part of that, essentially all of the specifically Protestant elements of America and its history were sort of de-Protestantized, in a sense. And so, and so, everything that Protestant Americans did is now just generically American. Mm-hmm. And there's very important reasons why we should do that, actually, and why we should be glad because we don't actually want the American founding to be viewed as proprietary to one ethnic or religious group. We want, again, like my Sicilian ancestors, to feel like that is theirs. And you don't do it if you portray it in a sectarian sense of the word. Just as, we want, hopefully, the children of today's immigrants to have, to identify themselves in, the victories of World War II and, Manifest Destiny and all of that stuff. And so if you kind of like sectarianize it, then you can't do that. And so I think there's like very good reasons why we don't do it. But the problem is that when like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, all of the great Protestant institutions, all the great Protestant history has now been recapitulated in essentially generic American. Then what do you point to in the past? It's and say that you produce. So the Catholics, that's been a great boon to Catholic recruiting, because now they've delighted on being part of the mainstream of American culture, but they've never let go of their own particular institutions, their own particular heroes. They know John F. Kennedy was a Catholic, right? They know who the great Catholic heroes of America are, and the great Catholic thinkers, and all of these Catholic teachings, which gives a completely warped perspective on American history. It's like, as if, and so I think this idea that like all Protestant accomplishments are American, but all Catholic accomplishments are both American and specifically Catholic, is like an enormous benefit to them in recruiting. And Protestants need to actually like recognize like, we did some stuff. So like only the stuff they don't like prohibition, do they blame on Protestants. No, I mean like political conservative intellectuals are, a lot of them are, candidly, some of them are historical frauds in the way that they portray American history. You can read a history of America for them, and like the word Protestantism basically never appears. And then it's like, oh, it's this Catholic guy rewriting the history of America. to essentially, of course the Puritans, I'll talk about the Puritans and that, but it's like
they burned a witch and it was a bad idea.
All right, I attended a big conference last year where people whose names you would know were talking about American founding and American history, and every last one of them simply referred to Christianity. I'm like, okay, great. This is like a scholarly conference. It's just Christianity. I don't think it's just Christianity. I don't think we were 98% Protestant country at the founding. And so I think, again, I understand some of the reason and the thinking behind that. And there's good things. We don't want to go back and re-sectarianize the history of the country, but we also have to recognize that, like, hey, guys, like, the Catholics are they have self-interested reasons for promoting those kinds of views of history, because it's a great recruiting tool for them. It's a great recruiting tool for them.
I liked what you said.
Sorry, Luke. Sam. You're getting the Luke treatment. Wow, you gotta watch this. Once they get past Aaron having to sort of soothe Sam a little bit about some of the things Aaron has said about Chicago and not being able to actually hit nosebleed elite status in Chicago, you have to go to New York or L.A., which is true. Aaron to me is one of the guys that is so underrated in this sphere. And the reason he's underrated is that he will simply tell you what he thinks is true. And it doesn't fit sort of the Catholic narrative or the ortho narrative or the movement conservative narrative or the evangelical narrative. But, pretty much everything he said a lot of what he said in this video, I just thought, wow, you're exactly right. And nobody's saying it, and nobody's saying it because they don't want to admit it. Now, there are a lot of real downsides going on in this, because the truth is that there's no going back. Many of the founding fathers were deists, which is sort of, you're not going to have a person, which is the reason that far later evangelicals had to, like Chuck Colson, had to find a personal relationship with God, because if you're deist, you don't really have the personal relationship with the clockmaker who wound it up and pushed it out into space. So there's basically what Aaron Renn is saying is that the Catholics are kind of playing a little game, a little selectivity game, that they all get super patriotic about this country and salute a bunch of Protestant deists. And the Catholics in their day were very much not there with the American project, because, in fact, you had the English Revolution, you had the killing of Charles I. Now we have Charles III, but you had the restoration of the monarchy in England. I mean, there's just a ton of history that has come over this. And Aaron, he's not a redeemed Zoomer who is just sort of waiting for the main line to become great again. Aaron Renn pretty much knows the main line is dying or dead, and the evangelicals are showing no real legitimate cultural game, and the Catholics are eating their lunch. But the Catholics, someone sent me this very interesting survey surveying young priests versus old priests, and it very much tracks with my very limited experience with Roman Catholic priests like Father Big Mac in the corner, or Father Connor, that I'll be getting to know as I leave tomorrow for England and Scotland. But the paragraph that jumped out at me is, in the context of the abuse crisis, a significant portion of American priests say that they had personally experienced sexual harassment or abuse or suffered sexual misconduct during their formation or time in seminary. A large majority of priests, 71%, know at least one victim of clerical abuse. Only 30% of priests know 3 or more. I went to Christian Reformed Day School and Calvin College and Calvin Seminary. The numbers of people that I know in terms of seminarians and colleagues of mine who would claim any kind of sexual harassment, abuse, or sexual misconduct suffered by CRC clergy or seminary staff to them, it's not exactly zero, but it's not far from it. And so they're celebrating only 30% of priests personally know 3 or more. And it's like, so yeah, and the Catholics have their own issues, and I'm not trying to dump on the Catholics. I'm super excited to go to Ireland and get to know many more, and the Catholics that I know, Cale Zeldin and Father Big Mac, and many of you who have joined the Catholic Church, you're absolutely lovely people, and if coming to Christ means you've got to go to the Catholics, by all means do it. And help reform that church and make Catholicism great again. I'm cheering for you, but this was a bracing study, and it's like, wow, that's just plain terrifying. So we're in a point now where the blue church or the cathedral is just crashing down around us. On CRC Voices, David Snapper was sharing statistics in the Christian Reformed Church of just how many CRC churches have less than 5 children in them, or let's say 0 children in them. That the Christian Reformed Church is, at this point, a builder and boomer church, and there are some thriving congregations, most of them conservative, not all. Some of those Grand Rapids congregations are doing pretty well. And so I cheer them on too in terms of they're being exiled, but I want them to get their act together and I want them to do well. But I mean, things are not good. And for a long time, what I've seen in terms of movement conservatism has been resistance. And Renn says it quite well.
Well, it is important to recognize that, evangelicals were originally Democrats. Jimmy Carter was the first evangelical president of the United States. And you may recall there were a lot of concerns by some people that, like, what's it going to mean to have this Bible thumper in the White House? And, I think James Davison Hunter, the eminent sociologist from the University of Virginia, his first book was in like 1982 or 1983 called, I think, American Evangelicalism. And he cited some polling research that even then a plurality of evangelicals identified as Democrats, even though they may have voted for Reagan. And really, I'm not like a complete expert on how it came about, but there was a movement in the late 70s and the early 80s known as the New Right. When people talk about, a lot of people talk about a new right today. There's nothing older than a new right. I mean, there's always a new right. But the main thing that was called the New Right came in the 70s and 80s, and it was a little more populist. It was, there hasn't really been a great history of it written, so far as I know, but it led to things like the creation of the Heritage Foundation and stuff like that. And really, the New Right people got very connected with folks like Jerry Falwell, and they were sort of brought into the Republican fold over the course of the 1980s, through a number of, probably a number of ways. It was really the 1980s that evangelicals really realigned into this sort of Reagan coalition. And so I think some of it is related to broader demographic realignments that may not have anything to do with religion. But I do think it's interesting there that evangelicals would not have been considered particularly political. I think, nor would to the extent that they voted Democrat up through the 1970s. But it's really in the 1980s that the religious right, as we understand it, emerged.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that sort of creates this spiral where the Democrats are reticent of the Republicans' religiosity, the Republicans are reticent of the Democrats' irreligiosity, and it sort of creates this polarizing?
this is nothing remotely asymmetric. I mean, the left has been the aggressor on the cultural front in everything. I mean, the right has been playing defense on basically every issue for as long as anyone can remember. There's been very little, if any, kind of cultural advance made by the right. One example, one kind of exception might be something like gun rights, where there has been a kind of very expansive movement of gun rights. But the Second Amendment people are very populist. They get little to no support from like big money, elites. They're not loved in the conservative think tank worlds. That was like almost like a movement that took place kind of outside of the traditional conservative infrastructure. And groups like the NRA were always careful to make sure that they never became overly affiliated with the Republican Party. Their basically view is we're in the gun business, and if you are a strong pro-gun rights Democratic incumbent, we will endorse you. And they did. They got they endorsed plenty of Democrats because they're like, our issue is guns. Do what we want. We don't care what party you are, which I think there's some lessons in that. So I'm not saying there's none, but it's like rarely is rarely is there that much cultural aggression, I think, coming out of the right. And to the extent that they're perceived as culturally aggressive, it's because they want to undo something that the left actually successfully implemented. So like the anti-DEI push, you can say it's culturally aggressive, all these executive orders Trump is signing to push it out, but like it's not like he's really replacing it with anything like some other I got some other cultural ideology that's innovative and new that I'm pushing. The reality is, as we've seen for the last 10 years, they're coming after you on everything, and like no matter where you are, every institution. So you basically either have to sort of go along with what the sort of kind of the left wants, or you have to fight back. Those are your two things because they're extremely culturally imperialistic.
So, Donald Trump, the 80s were good years for the Donald, make 1980s great again. Women were young, cocaine was abundant, New York City, disco, there it was. Of course, Donald's body probably can't take cocaine anymore, and probably his days of chasing women are over. So, hey, 3 cheers for the age of decay, at least in terms of the White House, because we've had a lot of that in the White House. But what's interesting about this moment now is that, okay, the dog has caught the bus. What do you do with it? Somebody sent me the Benjamin Boyce, Aaron MacIntyre video and said, oh, you're going to want to watch this. So I did watch it. And because the person had sent it to me, I get recommendations. I get a lot of recommendations. So just the complaint that you don't watch enough of my channel probably isn't enough to set it. But certain people who almost never recommend something, but I know them from certain contexts, and then they say, ooh, this one you're going to want to watch. Well, I did watch this one, or listen to it rather. And it was important because I think now that the dog has caught the bus, for the first time, movement conservatives are, okay, the reactive game, it's easy to build a coalition against. To actually build something positive, much different. And, I'm just on the heels of going to ARC and my conversation with Paul Kingsnorth, so this is super salient for me. Because right now, in terms of the coalition that has dethroned the Democratic Party, you've got this strange mixture of conservatives and transhumanists. And it's like, at some point, Mary Harrington's going to arise like Joan of Arc and be all over Elon Musk, and not in a good way. So we are living in super interesting times.
This is the problem with going back in time. You say, well, we'll stop it at 1776, right? But then you do analysis of that, and you're like, well, the seeds of the revolution are already there. And then you're like, well, where do you go back? You go back to the Reformation. Well, the seeds of the revolution are already there. Like, where do you end? One of the most beneficial aspects of my conversation with Joel Berry and Dave Green was that, well, one of the places where I think they both agreed was that Christianity is probably the only way forward for America. Some form of Christianity, which is like an open question then, because you're like, well, which Christianity are we talking about? You're a Baptist, Dave's a Catholic, Joel's a evangelical. So is there something, is there like a post-liberal, post-modern Christianity? Is that something that's possible now? Is that something that's viable now?
Yeah, I believe so. I've been talking a lot about Samuel Huntington and his book, Who Are We? And I think it's a good book because Huntington is like a center-left Harvard professor. He's not some race realist, some right-wing bomb thrower, any of this stuff. But he says in his book, to his credit, despite his political disposition and his stature in the academy, that the Anglo-Protestant identity is the American identity. And as we break away from these highly ideological identities that define the Cold War and kind of the post-war consensus, that a return to Anglo-Protestant identity is going to be key to the American identity. And of course, being a man of the left, he's not, some guy who says, well, we got to get rid of all other religions or races or anything like that. But he says, look, if you're going to have assimilation, people have to assimilate to something. You have to understand what America is before you can ask people to become American. And very clearly, historically, throughout the American experience, it has been the Anglo-Protestant founding of the nation that people have had to assimilate to. And he talks about even Jewish and Catholic Americans would look distinctly American to their Jewish and Catholic brothers abroad. The Catholic bishops abroad would complain about the Protestant nature of Catholic bishops in the United States. And so even if they don't convert to the religion, they are so deeply influenced by the culture of the United States that they take on aspects of it, even in the religions they're practicing that are not that. So this is not the call of Christian nationalism in the sense of, the leftist extremist warning version of this, where like everyone will convert to Protestant Christianity or die or something like that. But it's the understanding that this is unapologetically the core of American identity. We're going to set our holidays around this. We're going to define our culture by this. This is what we're going to teach in schools. This is what we're going to expect you to assimilate to when you come over. Now, if you maintain, Hinduism or Judaism or Catholicism in, your own practice, that's fine. But the culture that's taught in schools, that's perpetuated by institutions, that is observed by our government, it will be Anglo and Protestant in nature. You may join it, you may assimilate to it if the American people provide you that opportunity. But that is what you will be aligning yourself with. And ultimately, I think that's right. I love Dave. I welcome him back from the hellscape of Canada with open arms. But when he comes back,
I thought you were going to say papistry, but Canada's not that.
But his popery will have to be put to the side when he returns to the United States. And we should be able to make those jokes and enjoy each other's company, but understand that is the nature of the nation. And so I think that is the binding agent that moves us forward together. It is Christianity, but it's not just Christianity, because Ethiopia is a Christian country. There are plenty of Christian countries that are very unlike the United States. What makes the United States specific is its specific mixture of Anglo-Protestantism with kind of the other Germanic and Irish and other cultures that came in. And obviously, Black Americans have been here from their founding, and they themselves are going to be a part of America as well, into that admixture. But that needs to be the core. That needs to be what people are assimilating into. And I think that is...
See, and I hear this and I think this is naive, because it's, in a sense, it's naive on a few fronts. Number one, all of the complaint from like Paul Kingsnorth that says Christianity, against the utilitarians, Christianity, if used as a tool in order to prop up a nation, that project is going to fail. And I think Kingsnorth is exactly right. You don't become a Christian because you think it's good for the nation. This is a religion that asks its people to love its enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And this is part of Paul Kingsnorth's point, that this is what Christianity is about. The leader of Christianity is not riding on a horse into Jerusalem, killing Romans and saying, make Israel great again. Let's take all of the things that the Pharisees want and push away all the stuff that the Greeks want. That was tried, and it failed. The Romans are like, we're not having it. We're going to level Jerusalem, and we're going to keep all you people out, and we're going to put a temple to Jupiter up. But that didn't work either. Eventually, Christianity came into Jerusalem, and of course, Constantine put up all of the sites. And I'm actually reading a book on the Crusades right now, which is super fascinating in terms of some of those turns. Oh, I got an extra camera I got to turn off. Don't want to have Sam Tiedemann reverb God voice. The point is that it needs to be, now we're going to get into the third video where this language was not used, but it was very much behind it, where the people themselves, or at least a critical mass of the people, authentically embrace that cultural amalgam. Because many Europeans out there will say, oh, American cultural Christianity is this, it's a melting pot. You've got some stuff from the Germans, you've got some stuff from the English, a little bit from the Dutch, you've got the French, you've got the Spanish, you've got the Hispanic. It's the part of what made, see, this is where we really need to come to grips with the fall of the waspy, mainline lion culture that Aaron Renn keeps pointing to, and the rise of the fox culture that said, we're not going to insist on just about everything, but we're going to use soft power to slowly colonize you, and which sort of did that through Hollywood. But what conversation was I listening to where they were talking about, I think it was the Aaron Renn conversation too, when he was talking about movies. Was that it? But maybe it's the video I'm about to play next. But it needs to be what the people really believe. And that's the difference between the political, which is fundamentally instrumental. But the instrumental is built on a fully embraced belief system that people say, this is reality. This is the world. This is how I see the world. And sort of what the genius of America was, it was able to sort of take all of those and have enough critical mass to do something with the culture. Now, did it get plenty wrong? Of course. And, what really overthrew, I think, the mainline world was the complete embarrassment that 100 years after the Civil War, race-based segregation in the South was still standard operating procedure, and African Americans were viciously lynched, and the criminal justice system did nothing about it, or at least very little often. So, and that was a huge, basically what happens in the civil rights movement is, remember, Martin Luther King comes in there in his I Have a Dream speech and says, basically affirms Jefferson, not like the woke who sort of dumped on Jefferson, affirms Jefferson and says, okay, Father Tom Jefferson had a promissory note that has been refused to be paid, and now is the time to pay it. And the civil rights movement comes through, and whoosh, America is changed. But again, it's that level of religious consciousness that is necessary to actually achieve the political consensus that was. And No think tank is going to say, well, let's do a survey over parts and times of America that seem to go well, and we can either revive waspy pre-World War II mainlinism, or we can sort of look at Roosevelt, Protestant Catholic Jew, and we'll go back. That's all just going back, and there's no going back. The metagelical age is here. The Catholics are here, and they're doing great. The Orthodox are coming in strong. The evangelicals are kind of a mess, and that's part of the reason that traditional Catholics and Orthodox are sort of doing to the evangelicals what the evangelicals did to the mainline, and something is going to emerge. And so the strategy of utilitrads, who they themselves aren't part of a something that they believe wholeheartedly, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. These kinds of things emerge. And what that means is that the institutions of the religions are going to have their combination of what needs to die dying and something new coming up if this thing is going to go. Was it Sun Tzu that said, the war is won in the temple long before it ever reaches the battlefield? I think that's true, because people will only die for something they really believe in. This apologetic point made about the apostles, that these men died, and if, Christ's resurrection was a hoax, you get to the point and it's like, gosh, I used to at least be a middle-class Galilean with a solid fishing business, and the Galilee, the Greek language suburbs that were moving in next door that gave employment to our sons like Jesus as a construction worker, and employment to our daughters that would be sometimes prostitutes, or the wealthy among us being tax collectors. That wasn't good, but I'm going to exchange that for roaming all over the diaspora of the Roman Empire and fighting incessantly with my own people on one side and Romans on the other side, and in the end get killed by Nero, who burned down Rome to make room for his palace so he could have a really lovely lake, which then they put the Colosseum on top of. So, you only die for what you really believe. Now, it doesn't mean you're right, because lots of people die. I mean, just look at what they're finding from the North Koreans in Ukraine, still out there dying for their dear leader, and the rest of the world is looking at them like, oh, you poor soul. Oh, what a crazy country. North Korean leaders, not our picture of divinity. Here's a third video. And this one is another must watch. Sam the other day on the live stream said, you got to pay more attention to what Paul Anlietner's doing, because Paul Anlietner is using culture and getting into modernity, post-modernity, meta-modernity. But even though, see, last time Paul and I tried to have a conversation, we just couldn't make our schedules mix because we both got these day jobs. And so it has to work out for both of us, and we both have limitations. But what Paul is doing here, pay more attention to our own Michael Sartori, because, Michael is a real sleeper in the corner, but the dude who writes an 800-page book and keeps pumping out videos and came up with Boomerality, Michael is really tracking with a lot of what is going on, and he's the Gimli of the corner, and he swings an axe, and but Paul, it was so interesting because I remember listening to Clay Routledge talk to Jordan Peterson about nostalgia. And of course, John Vervaeke has on his tombstone, against nostalgia. And, they were able to have a meeting of the minds here. But Paul Anlietner is dead on right in pointing to, sort of neo-sincerity or meta-modernity or, and now Paul isn't using sincerity culture, authenticity culture, pro-felicity culture, like Georg, oh shoot, what's his last name over at the Traveler, the way, I don't remember him. He wrote the book. I've talked about it. It's all out there. I have to find the right clip to play now. Now Paul sets up the conversation with sort of as a good preacher does. He sets them up, and he's expecting that the Jesus answer, in Sunday school, every correct answer is Jesus. Well, as Paul sets them up, the correct answer is narrative, but they don't quite take the bait too much. These academics are pretty savvy about this, but they get there eventually. And it's been fun watching John continue to develop his take on narrative. Now, again, I'm going to Ark, and the whole point about Ark is telling a better story, but I'm still not entirely sure that the platform that Ark is creating is the platform that accomplishes what they're looking for. But let's pick this up here.
Is meaning in life also has to be shareable, right? If the culture is going to create an arena, there has to be shareable meaning in life. This is one of the problems with the current construct. It's so individualistic and internalistic. It's missing the aspirational, it's missing the cultural shared aspects of meaning in life. But what narrative does, think about the stories that Clay's talking about, they not only give us this aspirational dimension, they give us a shared modeling, all right, a shareable. So we're not only being given the means to, aspire our agency, we are also being given an arena in which we can properly fit ourselves. And so I think narratives also perform that cultural shaping function of the environment that's also needed for us to, Kelly Allen's notion, to belong, to feel like we fit in, that we are welcomed in some.
And that's exactly where the political pundits are like, yeah, we need a shared culture. And you political types, that's not what you major in. You major in bickering about application. That's what you major in. And you might whine about a shared narrative and arenic context and all of that, but it's the culture makers. And, I think enough, we've seen enough to know that Hollywood has sort of run its course, but Hollywood is downstream also from the church and the temple. And so that Hollywood has run its course, it's because the people in my role, the clergy, it's interesting when the clergy were sort of at the center of things back in mainline pre-World War II. And then after World War II, you had Billy Graham. Billy Graham was sort of this transitional figure from someone fulfilling sort of a mainline role. But Graham, there wasn't anyone who came. Rick Warren, America's pastor, at the first Obama inaugural, and then, of course, all the drama around the second Obama inaugural when Giglio was disinvited because he wasn't affirming of same-sex marriage. This stuff has been with us, and again, it's all about, paying attention to what's happening.
Some way by the world and by both the social world and the biological world.
I'd like to pose maybe a problem that I think hopefully we are going to work together, and you have been, your life's work has been dedicated to solving this problem in one way or the other. And I'd like to put it in a narrative form, because maybe this will be most helpful. As you joked earlier, Clay, I am old enough to remember the pre-PowerPoint days and having overhead projectors and slides. And but I'm old enough to remember seeing a movie like Rocky IV for the first time, and watching it without a tinge of irony.
All right, here's a preacher. What's Paul doing? This is standard Jedi preacher tricks. Here's the illustration. Here's the story. Here's the narrative.
It was pure sincerity. It communicated a narrative that it seemed like at the time much of, let's say, the dominant macro culture in America. Of course, you always have, your macro cultures, and you have subcultures and micro cultures, but the dominant macro culture largely was in support of this Rocky IV, American exceptionalist vision. We're still in the thick of the Cold War. So I remember that time. I've been joking over the last few episodes. I remember being a Hulkamaniac as a kid, a Hulk Hogan lover. Hulk Hogan was the professional wrestling version of Superman. And he stood for, you trained hard, you said your prayers, and you ate your vitamins, right? That was the key to
take a few roids too.
Living a virtuous life. And you had this kind of, often odd in reflection, theological reflection, synthesis of like this guiding story of American history and American culture, which largely contains these values, maybe we could say ingredients from the Enlightenment and from modernism. But then you also have always had this religious tinge and infusing of what we might say is, whether you want to call it Christianity or Christendom, that have been together part of what we could say the dominant guiding story of American culture. So I remember a time in which all of that was in vogue. I was very, very young. But in my formative teenage years and into my adult years, I also became acutely aware of how that story underwent challenges. Subcultures, had different narratives that maybe rose to the forefront. We saw in popular culture the dissemination of what we might think of as more postmodern values into popular culture in ways that didn't exist in pop culture in the 80s and 90s. So I am living through this, and part of my own journey, and I think, both of you have come from backgrounds in which, some form of religious guiding stories were a part of your life. Many people have experienced something that, from maybe an adult development perspective, isn't unique. There's always a time in your life where maybe you begin to reassess those stories that you heard as a child. I think that's a normal feature. But I also feel as if, and you can disagree with me on this, but I feel as if culturally we have gone through this unique time in which those stories we maybe held to, at least in the macro culture of American society, those stories that we held to were brought under intense critique, suspicion. John, you frequently have employed the terminology hermeneutic of suspicion to describe maybe the kind of postmodern ethos. And so as I lived through my teenage years and head into my college years, of course, maybe a normal part of development is to start to question those stories that you received as a child, the religious stories, the stories of your culture. I felt that. Many of my friends, I'm an elder millennial, and I think a very normative story for those that have come from my upbringing is a story in which we might employ a term called deconstruction, right? You go through a process in which the stories you received as a child, the narrative that you once lived in, you begin to reassess. And I went through my own process, but I also saw my friends, peers of mine, that went through a similar process. And what maybe they came out of in the end isn't like ever a rebuild, a reconstruction into some narrative. They experienced a term, John, you've used throughout your lectures and courses, what we might call domicide. That is, they left those guiding stories, they also lost community in a place of home. So if you think of somebody that maybe grew up in a traditional religious community and they begin to question that story, and then they leave that story, they are also typically leaving the community that shared that story together. And it's a very alienating experience. It can lead to stints of deep depression, deep questioning of whether or not you can ever find a story again. And my observation right now is, much of our culture has gone through that sense of domicide and that sense of loss of story. And yet we're also seeing this like hyper nostalgic movement in pop culture. Clay, this has been a major focus of your work. Every movie seems like it's a reboot. Every television series seems like it's either a reboot or let's take Lord of the Rings and let's come up on Amazon with a way of telling that story and maybe some, made up prequel for it. Star Wars is always being regurgitated. Marvel movies. Is this what we are trying to do, is to recover that sense of home? That sense of what we lost in maybe an experience of domicile? What's your read on that, Clay?
So yeah, let me start with something boring, but I think it's important.
It's not boring, but I don't have a lot of time. So watch the video. This video has less than 200 views. 195 views. And I'm thinking, wow. Now, again, views. But it makes me think of, basically what's happening in this little corner is that we're not watching primarily because of the algorithm. We're watching primarily because of relationships. And what we're actually doing is trying to put together a network of relationships where we can, it reminds me of the Inklings. They put together the Inklings because they weren't finding what they wanted to read. So let's write what we want to read, and let's have the conversations we want to have, and let's put the people together, and let's talk about the topics. And because I think what we're on here is what this moment requires. And I don't think it can happen at the political level. So I'm trying to figure out when to release the videos, because again, I won't be here to make new videos, and I'll be probably making a bunch of videos for the membership section. And I'll maybe have some of those that go to the main channel, but I don't know. I never know what it's going to be like when I'm traveling. I'll be in some hotel rooms, but when ARC starts, that's going to be crazy busy and. So don't know what my schedule is going to look like. But my conversation with Wokel, which will come out this week on the channel. Why did I think of that conversation here? Anyway, it's the re-knitting together of a culture, and that happens in lots of different ways. And I think that's what ARC wants to do. And so, yeah, but the complainers about, no, you can't, Christianity, and this is part of industrial Christianity. I mean, in some ways, to what degree did Constantine embrace Christianity to use it as a tool? And of course, that had its own history and did a lot. But finally, the whole point of the sovereignty of God is that Jesus is never our tool. We are his tools. And so the way to address this is not fundamentally political. It's fundamentally religious. And it will be religious institutions and religious practices and religious communities that re-knit a culture together. And part of the difficulty that we are facing as a culture is that cultures take time to knit together. And the pace of change right now in the world is so fast and so high, we don't quite know where to go and what to do. So I think I'll release this one tomorrow. I think I'll release Wokel on, tomorrow is Wednesday. I think I'll release Wokel on Thursday. And I've still got Kent Dobson. I had a wonderful conversation with a 14-year-old girl. It was a birthday present for her. Her father contacted me and asked, and we had a wonderful conversation. And at one point, someone knocked on my door, and I realized I hadn't recorded any of it. It might have been a really cool thing to share, even though I'm a little nervous sharing a video with a 14-year-old girl because, the internet is weird, but she was absolutely lovely, and her father was lovely, and the conversation was lovely. And she asked me questions that so many of you want to hear me answer. And because she's a 14-year-old girl, I had to really work hard to put it and to avoid all this technical speak that we have as preachers or academics. And I had to really put it in regular terms, and it was great. But it was never recorded. So just like an estuary meeting. So yeah, definitely watch Sam and, watch all 3 videos. But these three are promising to do another one, and I can't wait for that because they did really well, and it was a good talk, and yeah. See, if I say next videos will be from Europe, I'll probably make another video or two before I leave. One way or another, I don't know how. But anyway, some of you, I'll see you at ARC. This is going to be interesting. Some of you, the rest of you, leave a comment.